Okay, today's lesson is section 4.1, Life in the Colonies. The learning goal is I can analyze how geography affects the economic development of 3 colonial regions. Okay, so for review, geography has to do with the type of land that is prevalent in each of these 3 regions we're going to talk about. And when we talk about economic development, we mean how did the people in these different regions make money and survive. First, let's talk about the growth of the colonies. At this time, 1700 to 1770s, the population is just booming. So we go from about 250,000 people living in the U.S., or in the colonies, I should say, to 2.5 million in those 70 years. Of course, African American population is increasing drastically because of the slave trade. Okay, so roughly 690,000 Europeans and 278,000 Africans have moved to the colonies. All across the board, the number one occupation, the number one way of surviving is farming. It is the main economic activity in all of the colonies. In New England, they practiced something called subsistence farming. Okay, so subsistence basically means that you are taking care of yourself. You're producing just enough to feed yourself and your family. You're not buying goods, food from other farmers. You're not selling to anyone. You're just providing what you need. Okay, in a subsistence farming situation, every person in the family is going to be contributing, is going to be working, including the children, which means that they do not have the opportunity to go to school. So commerce in New England, that's the first region we're going to focus on here. You do have a lot of people that are making a living doing things other than farming. A lot of women are out there selling craft items, cloth, garments, candles, and you have skilled craftspeople. A lot of them are in New England because they're attracted to the large towns in New England. They're there to provide a service and sell goods, so they need a lot of people to sell to. New England, of course, is on the ocean. A lot of those big cities are right on the water, so shipbuilding is a huge industry in New England. There's also a lot of trees. That's where they're going to get their material to build the ships. Okay, so New England was the hub of the shipping trade because it had so many port cities. And then, of course, another industry that is tied to living near the water would be fishing. So seafood, staple of the New England diet. All right, let's talk about colonial trade. There's kind of 2 different types of colonial trade. The first would be trading amongst the colonies themselves, so going down the Atlantic coast and trading from the north to the south. And then, of course, they're also trading all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, international trade with other countries, particularly England and other countries in Europe. Okay. An important vocab word is called the triangular trade, and I'll show you an image of it in just a minute. But essentially, there are 3 legs to the triangular trade. They're sending on one leg sugar and molasses from the West Indies to the colonies. Okay. And then in the colonies, they are making rum from that molasses and producing tools that they are sending to West Africa. And then from West Africa is where your enslaved Africans are coming from. So yes, you're not reading that incorrectly. Human beings from West Africa are being traded for rum, sugar, molasses, and other goods like that. Here is an image of the triangular trade. You can sort of see from Europe, I'm not sure if you can read this, but you're getting manufactured goods, luxury items, guns and cloth and iron. Okay. From the colonies, you're getting whale oil, lumber, furs, silk, tobacco, sugar. And then they're also sending rum, gunpowder over to Africa. And you can see from Africa, in addition to things like gold and ivory and spices, the slaves are being sent over to the West Indies, where they're usually traded and brought back to the colonies. That one leg of the triangular trade that brings the slaves to the West Indies from Africa was called the Middle Passage. and it was quite a horrific thing. Slaves are chained together for months at a time. They're whipped. They're not taken care of, given very little to eat or drink, and the sick and dead were thrown overboard often because they were seen as not really being worth the trouble. Obviously, it is apparent that at that time, Africans were really not seen as human beings. They were seen more as objects to make money off of. Once they did reach the West Indies, like I said, they were poked and prodded by plantation owners and they were sold off. Oftentimes during the slave trade, families, if they had not been separated already, were sold to different owners and never were given the opportunity to see each other again. Okay, let's talk about the middle colonies. Okay, so these would be colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, for example. You can see in this picture that is a very large field, kind of like the ones you might see around here. This is not subsistence farming. These are not people that are farming just to feed their families like they were in New England. Okay, these people are selling cash crops, and the definition is pretty much what you would expect. Goods that are farmed to sell to others and make a lot of cash. Okay, so farming families in the middle colonies grew a lot more than what was just needed for their family. And New York City and Philadelphia, which were major cities in the middle colonies, became huge ports that they could sell the goods farmed by these cash crop farmers. There was some other industry in the middle colonies, crafts, carpentry, business in lumbering, and of course you had a lot of immigrants come to the middle colonies, a little bit different than in New England. Immigrants in the middle colonies were usually from Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and it offered a lot more diversity than you would see in New England at that time. The southern colonies had some similarities to the middle colonies because they also planted cash crops. The two most important cash crops in the southern colonies were tobacco and rice. If you remember, tobacco was the product that kind of saved Jamestown. It was a very significant crop in Virginia, the most important cash crop in Maryland and Virginia. Unfortunately, after a while, some of these farmers started having a surplus of tobacco, which led to falling profits. Essentially, they planted so much tobacco that they had more than people wanted to buy, and they were forced to lower the price. If you go further deeper south, in places like South Carolina and Georgia, the main cash crop was rice. And working in rice paddies is one of the most difficult jobs, very strenuous, hard labor. So of course that was reserved for slaves. It relied heavily on slave labor. Most people were not willing to do the work to produce rice on their own accord. Okay, so there are different types of farmland that can be found throughout the South. The first is called tidewater, and there's kind of a picture of that on the top. Tidewater are low-lying plains along the coast. They're usually located on rivers, so crops can be shipped. And this is where you're going to find large plantations. Plantations are large estates owned by, rich white people who generally have hundreds of slaves that are going to work the land. So the plantation owners are very wealthy. They can buy not just one or two slaves, but hundreds. And they own so much land that sometimes they have their own schools and chapels on their plantations. Then you have backcountry, which, as you can see in that bottom right picture, you're going to see more hills, trees. A lot of the people that are settling there are newcomers to the colonies. This is where you're going to see more of the tobacco and small corn farms. And these families sometimes did have slaves, but they were not as wealthy as those plantation owners, so they usually just had a few slaves. The thing to remember is that backcountry farmers greatly outnumbered plantation owners in the South. You were much more likely to be a farmer in the backcountry with maybe just a few slaves than to be one of the few wealthy plantation owners that owned hundreds and hundreds of slaves. I want to talk about a little bit more about slavery. The vast majority of slaves were field hands. They worked out in the fields, but some did work in the house, in the home. Usually women did housework. Slaves, of course, endured great cruelty. You can see in the picture here on the left, this is a man who has been whipped, which is something that often happened to slaves if they weren't seen to be obedient enough. Large plantation owners obviously couldn't oversee all of their hundreds of slaves, so they hired overseers, which were like bosses, to make sure that the slaves are working hard. In order to keep slaves from rebelling and to keep them under control, the South created slave codes, which are strict rules that govern the behavior and punishment of African Americans. Or I should just say Africans, because they did not have citizenship yet at this point. So for example, slaves were not allowed to be taught to read. They were also not allowed to assemble in large groups. Again, these are reasons to sort of keep slaves from gaining any power to perhaps rebel or overthrow the slave owners. The slave codes also allowed slaves to be whipped, hanged, burned, tortured, just treated quite terribly for various minor offenses. Okay. There was criticism of slavery even at this time. The majority of white Southerners were not slaveholders. That's something to remember. We tend to sometimes think that everyone in the South who wasn't a slave owned slaves, and that's really just not true. And then, of course, people in the North who were less likely to own slaves. Remember, you have a lot more subsistence farming up north. And a lot of religious groups did not approve of slavery. So the anti-slavery movement had started almost soon as slavery began.